Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Accurate podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It's Friday, the 17th of January here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Israel says it has finalised a ceasefire agreement with Hamas to pause the war in Gaza and free dozens of hostages after last-minute doubts.
China's economic growth beats expectations to meet Beijing's target of 5% after an 11th hour stimulus blitz.
Plus, we speak to the Reform UK leader Nigel Farage about Elon Musk, Donald Trump and his party's economic policies.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Israel's Prime Minister says his government has finalised an agreement with Hamas to pause the war in Gaza. In a statement released this morning, Benjamin Netanyahu said his security cabinet would meet later to approve the truce, suggesting it would begin on Sunday. That's despite his office yesterday accusing Hamas of reneging on some commitments. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is optimistic about the prospects for the future.
I am confident, and I fully expect that implementation will begin, as we said, on Sunday. It's not exactly surprising that in a negotiation that has been this challenging and this fraught, you may get a loose end.
Antony Blinken speaking there. The ceasefire is backed by US President Joe Biden and his successor Donald Trump, and will see Hamas release 33 of about 98 hostages still held in Gaza in the first 6-week phase of the ceasefire. In exchange, Israel will withdraw troops from populated areas of the Palestinian territory and free around 1,000 Palestinian prisoners.
Now, China's economy grew by 5% in 2024, beating estimates and hitting the government's target. The news comes after a stimulus blitz and export boom that boosted activity. Helen Chow, who is chief Greater China economist at Bank of America, says government intervention spurred the expansion.
There was some hope that actually after the policy package was delivered on September 24th, there could be some turnaround in the data. So I think that's, on the industrial side, which is very much helped also by the front-loaded export orders. So that, I think, clearly helped.
Bank of America's Helen Chow speaking there. China has vowed further monetary easing and stronger public spending this year as the economy braces for Donald Trump's return to the White House. The US president-elect has threatened tariffs of as high as 60% on Chinese goods.
Ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration, his closest UK ally says there are deals to be done with the new administration. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage will be attending the ceremony on Monday. In an interview with Bloomberg's UK Politics podcast, Farage says Elon Musk should be kept away from economic policy.
Musk is a force for good in terms of open democratic argument. When it comes to power and influence, I think the important thing is he mustn't be seen himself to be dictating what the Treasury Department do. And that is important.
And you can listen to that full interview with Nigel Farage on the Bloomberg UK Politics podcast. His Reform UK party is vying to replace the Conservatives as the main right-wing force in British politics, with a recent poll putting their support just behind that of the governing Labour Party.
TikTok looks poised to win a reprieve from a US ban. Under the law, it faces a shutdown on Monday, but the incoming president has pledged not to close the popular social media app. Bloomberg's James Wilcock has more.
What does the incoming US administration's China policy look like? Trump has been characteristically hard to pin down, threatening tariffs, but also inviting President Xi to his inauguration. TikTok is set to be one of the first tests of the government's instincts, and many are watching to see how they handle economic and business ties with China. That may include Chinese intelligence, who Bloomberg have learned hacked Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's computer in their recent cyber attack. In London, James Wilcock, Bloomberg Radio.
Bloomberg has learned that Rio Tinto and Glencore are in the early stages of talks around a merger. If it were to happen, the tie-up would be the largest ever mining deal, creating a rival to sector leader BHP. The mining industry has seen a wave of deal-making in recent years, driven largely by big producers' desire to expand copper production. Representatives for both Rio Tinto and Glencore have declined to comment.
Now, Donald Trump's nominee for US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is set to be confirmed in the role following his hearing yesterday. During the session, the veteran fund manager emphasised the importance of tax cuts. He aligned himself with Donald Trump's economic goals.
This is the single most important economic issue of the day. If we do not fix these tax cuts, if we do not renew and extend, then we will be facing an economic calamity.
Scott Bessent there testifying before the US Senate. It's unclear when the Republican-controlled Senate will vote on his nomination, despite suggesting that they will oppose other cabinet picks on President-elect Trump. No Democratic member stated specific objections to Bessent taking the Treasury job yesterday.
Those are your top stories. On the markets, we saw equity markets on Wall Street stalling yesterday. The rally, S&P 500 falling by 0.2%. Losses in tech had the Nasdaq slipping by 0.7%. Treasuries rose after the Fed's Waller said he wouldn't rule out an interest rate cut in March if inflation data continues to be favourable. The 10-year Treasury yield falling 4 basis points yesterday, holding steady today at 4.61%. Gilt yields in trading yesterday continue to decline. The 30-year gilt yield has rallied 20 basis points in the past 2 days. Today on the currency markets, the Bloomberg dollar spot index is 0.1% stronger. The pound is trading at 122.14, down 0.2%. Chinese stocks given a small boost by the better than expected GDP data. The CSI 300 is 0.6% higher.
Now those are the markets. In a moment we are going to bring you more on the ceasefire agreement in the Middle East, plus what we learned about the Chinese economy from the data that was out this morning.
A little bit later on we've got a big interview coming up for you as well. Caroline, you've been speaking to the Reform UK leader Nigel Farage.
Yes, we got to spend some time with him. He came into the Bloomberg studio yesterday. It's taken 30 years for Nigel Farage, the leader of the Reform UK party, to be elected to Parliament. The party is riding high in the polls, and that, I think, has been a really big surprise in the UK, only a point behind the ruling Labour Party. So we wanted to discuss with Nigel Farage the economic plans of Reform UK, and we got to spend 30 minutes with him, questioning him about that and obviously his ties to the US. I thought it was fascinating that after the row with Elon Musk, Farage is perhaps a bit more cautious. He still calls him a hero, but he says that Elon Musk should not be seen to be dictating what the Treasury Department does in the US. You had the clip of that earlier. Farage on the UK policy says that there are sector deals to be had with America. He talks about Trump being the most instinctively pro-British president that we've seen for decades. We can negotiate our own trade deals. I think that's really interesting. And then we went on to talk in depth about the manifesto and the proposals here in the UK.
These are things that perhaps we haven't heard Nigel Farage talk about in such detail before, particularly when it comes to their economic policies and how much they might cost.
Yes. And we know lots about his close relationship with Donald Trump. And so that's why we wanted, how does that translate actually into benefits for the UK? On the manifesto that was published obviously before the election last year, he doesn't call it a manifesto, he calls it a contract. He promises tax cuts would be paid for by spending cuts. Promises an extra 1.5% in UK growth per annum. We were looking at the manifesto numbers. They aren't really very detailed and they don't add up particularly. So I questioned him a lot about how his policies would really be different from Liz Truss or from the austerity policies that we saw throughout the 2010s. He really doesn't have an answer for that. And he did admit that actually it would be very painful for voters. I absolutely accept that big initial cost on day one. So I thought that was a key line. He's also, I think, softening his stance on immigration. Reform UK's immigration stance is shifting. In the manifesto, he talks about freezing immigration. He now says he's actually just pro-control. We are not putting up the barriers entirely. We're in favour of high-skilled immigration, especially for the City of London. He stresses that Reform UK is non-sectarian, non-racist. He also talks about AI coming to replace a lot of jobs. So he had lots and lots of things to say to us.
And we'll bring you some of that conversation in just a short few minutes. But let's go first to the Middle East for more on our top story this morning. Israel's Prime Minister says a ceasefire deal has now been finalised after it appeared at risk of collapsing yesterday. Dana Craig, who leads our breaking news team in the Middle East, joins us now for more. Dana, good morning. Yesterday morning, Benjamin Netanyahu had accused Hamas of reneging on parts of the ceasefire. Those issues appear to have been resolved now. What happened?
Morning. So after a day when the ceasefire deal was at risk of collapse, with Netanyahu saying that Hamas was going back on some of these commitments, hours ago we saw Netanyahu coming out with a statement to say that the deal has been finalized and suggesting it's still on track to start on Sunday. So some reports said that there was some opposition from Hamas on about Israel's presence along the Egypt border, but Hamas came out to say that it was still committed to that. But let's face it, for Netanyahu, this isn't a popular deal, and maybe, that 24-hour was perhaps to have more talks or negotiations with his coalition party. He's also facing opposition internally. We saw Ben-Gvir saying yesterday he will be quitting the coalition if the ceasefire is approved. Another minister, also a far-right minister, was saying, he would agree only to the first phase and want to see the resumption of the war after that pause. But even if members withdraw, I think Netanyahu's standing is still okay. He would have less of a majority that he had in parliament with his coalition, but it's still a majority though.
So what is expected then to happen on Sunday with the agreement in place if it does all go through?
Right. So the Security Cabinet should be meeting today to approve, likely, the ceasefire agreement. So on Sunday, what we would be seeing is guns going silent. An exchange of hostages and prisoners should take place. 33 out of the 98 Israeli hostages still held in Gaza, will be exchanged for the release of some 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. This should be a respite for, of course, some of the families of the hostages and, some Palestinians living in Gaza. But there are still Israelis held in Gaza, and Palestinians are pretty much going back to absolute rubble. So it's still a bleak picture even after with this pause. And of course, the second phase of that ceasefire is still, uncertain. We don't know whether that would actually lead to a permanent pause to the fighting.
Yeah, indeed, that's certainly the ambition of the United States and the administration that negotiated this deal as well. When we get to Sunday, Dana, what are the next steps that we should be watching for as to where progress towards a potential second phase would go?
Well, this is going to be the difficult part, and that's what everyone is looking at, is that whether this will be a permanent pause to the fighting. Because the hope is that it will be, and we're seeing Donald Trump taking office. It comes a day before Donald Trump takes office on Monday, and it seems that his top priority, is for that ceasefire to be permanent, to integrate Israel better into the region by forging this normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. And this seems to be the top priority for the Trump administration in this region in the Middle East. And of course, to pressure or hike pressure on Iran even more. So what we would be looking out for is whether this would pave the way for a permanent ceasefire, how Israel will be integrated better in this region with a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia if that happens, and of course reconstruction effort in Gaza, and the big question of who would govern Gaza after this. Is it going to be Hamas or a joint, probably government between the Palestinian Authority under Abbas and Hamas together? And that's still something Israel is against. So there are so many questions and still a lot of uncertainty, even after this ceasefire takes effect.
Okay, Dana, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Dana Crash leads our breaking news team in the Middle East, just taking us through what's expected to happen with this ceasefire deal potentially in place.
China's economy hit the government's growth target last year after an 11th hour stimulus blitz and an export boom turbocharged activity. The outlook, though, decidedly more uncertain. Let's bring in our senior China economics reporter, James Mager, who's in Beijing for us. James, good to have you on. How much of this economic performance that we learned about in this latest figures was down to stimulus steps?
I think a substantial amount of what we saw in the fourth quarter is due to the stimulus that the government started rolling out, in late September, and the rest is probably due to the massive export boom we saw all of last year, which picked up even further in the fourth quarter as well, as companies in the US and other places tried to get as much goods out of China as they could before Donald Trump returns to the White House and puts tariffs on them. So, but the rebound we saw in housing prices, for example, and the slight increase we saw in housing sales in November and December, I think you can definitely say that's the core. That's due to both the deregulation of housing purchase controls in many cities across China, and also the central bank cutting rates and making it cheaper for people to borrow and to buy a house. So there has been a result, or a sort of that stimulus that they did in the fourth quarter has had some success. But as you say, there are still a lot of challenges that the economy is facing now. And I think especially, obviously they reached their growth target of 5% for real growth. But when you look at nominal growth and you strip out, or you ignore the effects of inflation, the economy is still in deflation. Prices fell for a second year in a row. We're looking at prices falling again this year, which will be a third year of deflation. And company profits are falling, household incomes are falling. All of these things are going in the wrong direction. And I think, especially if you add in tariffs on top of that, which will damage the export growth driver, that's really not putting China in a good position for 2025.
Absolutely. So then what about the specific sectors also that we've watched so closely, in recent years? The property industry, is there a sign of revival there if the overall picture is so difficult as you describe it, James?
There is some signs of revival in some places in China. If you look at the housing market in Beijing, for example, or the bigger cities, there has definitely been a pickup in sales. And that is due to, basically all of the big cities especially got rid of all of their purchase curbs. So previously, if you wanted to buy a second home or a third home, you had to put a bigger deposit down. The interest rate was higher and all these kinds of things. And those have all basically been gotten rid of to encourage more people to buy more homes. And so that is having an effect, especially in those bigger cities. But if you look at the construction side of the economy, which is where the actual economic impact of the housing market is going to be, we didn't see much of a turnaround. Housing starts fell for a fifth year last year. It was down 20-something% last year. That's on top of a double-digit fall in 2023, which is on top of falls in. So it's been. I think housing starts are about a third of their peak in 2020. It was either 2019 or 2020, and so unless you see a turnaround in that kind of construction activity, that's not going to flow through to demand for steel and all the other things that go into building apartment buildings. So yes, there is some early signs of a bit of a turnaround or a sort of a pickup, but that's still really just at the sales side. On the consumption side, where we really need to see a turnaround or a change is on the construction and demand side, and we're not really seeing that yet.
How much of a risk do trade tariffs under Donald Trump pose to the Chinese economy in 2025? We're told that President Xi is not going to attend the inauguration, despite reports that he had been invited. Would have been unusual for him to go anyway, but he's not going, we've been told.
Yeah, I mean, he was never going to go. And Han Zheng, the vice president, is going. He attended, say, the coronation of the Japanese emperor a few years ago. And so so there was Wang Qishan, his predecessor, went to the enthronement of the Japanese emperor a few years ago. But, a vice president going, I think, is probably the highest level representation China would have had at this kind of event. But, I think tariffs do represent a real threat to China. Direct exports to the US last year were 15% of all China's exports. If you count the exports that are going to places like Vietnam and being assembled into goods like AirPods and then being exported to the US, it's probably closer to 20%, which is the level it was at before the trade war in 2017, 2018. And so we have seen a bit of a shift of Chinese trade, but China is still very dependent on the US as a source of final demand. So if tariffs are raised from their already reasonably high levels on Chinese goods going to America, and especially if America then tries to stop Chinese companies, investing in Indonesia, investing in Vietnam to make goods there to then export them to America, I think that's going to be very damaging to that source of final demand for China. And then the other problem is if American import demand goes down and Chinese domestic demand doesn't pick up to fill that hole, then the goods that Chinese companies are producing will be exported elsewhere. And if they're exported elsewhere and prices go down because demand is weak, then other countries are going to be looking at that and say, hey, we don't want this even bigger flood of cheap Chinese goods coming onshore. We don't want this Chinese steel. We don't want these Chinese products that compete with their own companies. And so they might start to raise tariffs. You're already seeing some of that on steel and EVs, famously in the EU EU and Turkey and other places. But if that expands to a lot of other goods, not only is the US market sort of much more difficult for Chinese companies, but then, Australia or South America or Southeast Asia or Europe, those markets all become much harder to access, and China loses that demand as well. So, there's a real risk to China, both from the tariffs in America directly, but then the spillover effects that might have around the rest of the world. And so I think, especially last year, the end of last year, the government stimulus, the extra spending, the extra bond sales we saw from the government was the real driver of that pickup. And in 2025, maybe we have to see even more of that to fill in the hole that's going to come from export demand weakening.
Okay, James Mager, our senior China economics reporter, thank you very much.
Now, to our key interview this morning. It's taken 30 years for Nigel Farage to become elected to Parliament here in the UK. His Reform UK party is riding high in the polls, a point behind the ruling Labour Party. But do Farage and Reform UK's economic plans add up? The Reform UK leader has been speaking to me alongside Bloomberg's finance reporter Will Shaw. I also began by asking him about how Britain will be engaging with the new US president and the incoming Trump administration.
It isn't just Trump that I've known for a long time and get on very well, which I do. Half his cabinet I know. Some of them are good friends. This whole movement, they're people I've worked with for a long, long time. So, if there's anything I can do, for example...
Well, so you must know Lord Mandelson very well. Obviously, he's a veteran politician. So what do you think of his appointment? And can you get...
Mandelson and I were in Brussels at the same time,
yes.
When he was a commissioner there. Look, Mandelson is bright and clever, wily possibly too. Nobody could ever doubt that Mandelson is not a good operator. I mean, he was part of the genius behind, New Labour and the rebranding of the party. All I would say is this, that if you really want to get on with the Trump administration, you need somebody who is an entrepreneur. You need somebody who's a businessman or businesswoman. You need someone who thinks outside the box. And kind of what we're doing is we're going down the traditional Foreign Office governmental route of appointing somebody from within our governing circles. And I think we could do better. I mean, look...
You're obviously at odds with the Labour government.
Yes.
Are you going to work together with Peter Mandelson, and will you brief against him and the Labour government to Donald Trump if you differ on...
I will get back to the original question. Mm-hmm. I've said privately and publicly to senior Labour figures that if they need help with the relationship, particularly in terms of negotiating tariffs or maybe sectoral free trade agreements, which I do believe are possible with the Trump regime, I of course would help, because that is in the national interest. And I have to say, sitting here this morning with you, how relieved I am that the Chagos Island surrender of sovereignty, as I see it, isn't going through before the inauguration. I think if that had happened, we would be in a very, very bad place. So we've got a bit of a reprieve. And remember that Trump is the most instinctively pro-British president we've seen for decades. And we ought to use that to our advantage.
How does that really translate, though, in terms of how hard Trump is going to be on tariffs globally and especially on the UK?
I can tell you that in 2016 and past the inauguration into the early part of 2017, the team around Trump were really anxious to get a trade deal with the UK and to do it as quickly as possible. Why? They wanted to show that they're not protectionists. They believe in fair competition, but not, as they see it, unfair competition with China and other countries that undercut them on wages, on environmental standards and everything else. So, and of course, we couldn't do it because we were still part of the European Union. But now we're freed. We're not part of the EU's common commercial policy. We can negotiate our own trade deals. These are the prizes that are on offer. But, if the Prime Minister wants to have a reset with the European Union and get closer to the failing, economically, European Union, it's going to be very difficult.
If we turn to Elon Musk, so
I thought you might.
Yeah, Joe Biden was speaking overnight. He warned Americans of a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a very few ultra wealthy people that he feared could have an impact on the country's democracy. Through your friendship with Elon Musk, is there a risk of you introducing a similar threat into the UK in terms of the interests of one very, very rich tech billionaire and his concerns taking priority over the concerns of regular voters and, the potential of someone being seen to try and buy an election in the UK?
Well, first things first, I think Biden's record on defending the American Constitution, on the way that he used the judicial system, doesn't bear much scrutiny. I think things went backwards during Biden's time, and we concentrated so much power in Biden's hands that he gave Afghanistan back to the Taliban. So, we can throw this stuff back and forth. In America, billionaires have more influence over society than we do in Britain. There's no, culturally, there's no question about that. Musk is a very powerful figure, of that there's no doubt. But I also think he's a hero. I mean, if you think back to the last election in 2020 in America, where the Hunter Biden laptop was there, the evidence was clear of criminality, for which he's now been convicted of one or two things. The evidence was, all sorts of things were there that deserved to be in the public domain, especially his father's close relationship and telephone calls with various companies.
That's a separate issue.
No, it isn't.
I guess.
No, it isn't at all, and I'll tell you why. All the social media channels forbade any conversation about that subject. The Americans had an election with no debate on this issue. Musk has come along and bought Twitter, albeit for quite a high price, and free speech is coming back to America and the Western world. You've even seen Meta in this week. An extraordinary U-turn that has been made. So Musk is a force for good in terms of open democratic argument. When it comes to power influence, I think the important thing is he mustn't be seen himself to be dictating what the Treasury Department do, and that is important.
You talk a lot about your close relationship with the US and how important that relationship is. Our closest trading partner is still the EU.
Only in your mind. Our biggest country relationship is with America.
But not trading.
No, well, Germany's a country still, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, there you are.
The EU as a whole. Who's
the biggest foreign investor in Britain?
I also talked about the rise of parties with similar views of anti-migration parties across Europe.
So, who said I'm an anti-migration party?
Well, you did yourself.
No, I didn't. I said the opposite. I said we're pro-controlling immigration.
Right-leaning parties.
You asked me about high-skilled people, and I said if they come into Britain, bring high skills, pay taxes and integrate, I've got no problem. Our brand of politics, my brand of politics, is different to many of the other European parties. All right? Let's be clear about that. There are similarities, there are crossover points, but there are differences. But let me just come back to Europe very quickly in the economics.
Yeah.
And a statistic that I think everybody following this podcast needs to just get embedded in their minds. I think it's crucial. In 2008, the American economy was exactly the same size as the Eurozone. Today it's double the size. Double the size. And that's what you get if you have economic policy based on idealistic but unrealistic net zero goals. Over-regulation, welfareism as being a really good alternative to going to work, and that's what you've got, a failing Europe. One of the reasons I wanted Brexit was to give us an opportunity to get away from that failing model. I'm not saying we have to be identical to America, but I think in terms of business culture, there's a heck of a lot we can learn.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.